Dear participants, ladies and gentlemen, welcome at the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens. Welcoming address by the Rector of the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens, Professor Meletios Athanasios Dimopoulos.
Dear Vice President of the Hellenic Parliament, Mr. Athanasios Bouras, dear President of the International Commission for the History of Representative and Parliamentary Institutions, Professor Zotzepa Agirakouana, dear Scientific Coordinators, Professor Evanthis Hadjivasiliou and Professor Spiros Vlachopoulos, dear Professors, ladies and gentlemen, dear National Governor of the International Commission, Mrs. Karvounaki. Liberty proposes knowledge and a strong intellectual and theoretical basis. It cannot come as a free gift to those who have not worked hard for it. The difficult, painful, and long process of the rise and establishment of our democracies attest to this. Liberty cannot come without the consideration of scientific knowledge, not only on the fields of the humanities or the social sciences, but also on hard science as well, which supports, enables, and rationalizes modern governance, as the recent pandemic and the admirable response of the global medical community have shown. This means that the processes which determine our institutions is a complex one. The study of the institutions of our societies and states, their evaluation and the debate on their possible expansion and betterment does not come only from the community of politicians. It mostly comes from researchers, academics, universities. It is us, academics and scientists, who trigger the invaluable process of reconsideration and evaluation, without which no progress can be made, without which the very survival of our freedoms is not certain. With these thoughts in mind, the National Kapodistrian University of Athens has readily and happily responded to the invitation of the International Commission for the History of Representative and Parliamentary Institutions to co-host this conference. The fact that one of its thematic subjects is the Greek Revolution during this year of its 200th anniversary honors us all the more. But for our university, however, it is not only this which is important. Mostly is the opportunity to perform our duty as a major academic institution and as a member of this global universe of academic and intellectual springboards for the betterment of governments and the securing of liberties throughout today's tormented world. Confident that we're going to further knowledge and that by doing so we're going to serve global high principles, the National Kapodistrian University of Athens welcomes all the colleagues who in our conference will discuss the crucial issues of parliamentary government, past, present, and future. I wish you the best possible success in your endeavors. Thank you very much.
Welcoming address by Mr. Athanasios Bouras, Vice Speaker of the Hellenic Parliament.
Εμένα θα μου επιτρέψετε να μιλήσω στα ελληνικά. Έχει διανεμηθεί η μετάφραση στα αγγλικά. Αξιότιμε κύριε Πρίτανη του Εθνικού και Καποδιστριακού Πανεπιστημίου Αθηνών, κύριε Δημόπουλε. Αξιότιμε κύριε Πρόεδρε της Διεθνούς Επιτροπής, κύριε ICHRPI, κυρίες και κύριοι καθηγητές σύνεδροι, από την αρχή της νεότερης εποχής, τα κοινοβούλια εξέφρασαν την απέτηση για ελευθερία και για πολιτική αντιπροσώπευση και αναδείχτηκαν ως η ελπίδα των λαών που ζούσαν υπό τον ζυγό του παλαιού καθεστώτος ή των δικτατοριών. Πολύ πρόσφατα, μόλις στο δεύτερο μισό του 20ου αιώνα, οι ευρωπαϊκές χώρες κατάφεραν να υλοποιήσουν τα όνειρα αμέτρητων προηγούμενων γενεών και να εγκαθιδρύσουν πλήρως λειτουργικές δημοκρατίες με σεβασμό των ανθρωπίνων δικαιωμάτων και πλήρη νομιμοποίηση. Αλλά αυτό δεν ήταν, όπως λέχτηκε κάποτε, το τέλος της ιστορίας. Η αναζήτηση της ελευθερίας δεν σταματά ποτέ. Πρέπει να διασφαλίσουμε ότι οι θεσμοί μας θα είναι ικανοί να προσαρμόζονται στις ραγδαία μεταλλασσόμενες συνθήκες, συμπεριλαμβανομένων της παρούσας πανδημίας ή της νέας τεχνολογίας. Και πιο πρόσφατα ανακαλύψαμε ότι ακόμη και σήμερα πρέπει να μπορούμε να προστατεύουμε τους δημοκρατικούς θεσμούς μας από διάφορους κινδύνους, όπως είναι η αίσθηση χαλάρωσης ή η τάση των ίδιων μας των κοινωνιών να εκλαμβάνουν ως δεδομένα τα δημοκρατικά μας κεκτημένα. Η αντιπροσωπευτική δημοκρατία είναι το προϊόν της διανόησης, της εγρήγορσης και της υπεύθυνης γνώσης. Εκπροσωπώντας τον πρόεδρο της Βουλής των Ελλήνων, τον κύριο Κωνσταντίνο Τασούλα, θα ήθελα να χαιρετήσω το γεγονός ότι το 72ο συνέδριο της Διεθνούς Επιτροπής πραγματοποιείται από κοινού με το Πανεπιστήμιο Αθηνών. Η μελέτη και η κατάκτηση της γνώσης σχετικά με τον τρόπο διακυβέρνησης που ακολουθούμε είναι προϋπόθεση για την επιβίωση και τη βελτίωσή του. Το συνέδριό σας συνεισφέρει καθοριστικά σε αυτόν τον κοινό μας στόχο. Η θεματική έμφαση στην ελληνική επανάσταση είναι σημαντική και γίνεται σε μια πολύ σημαντική χρονική συγκυρία που εμείς γιορτάζουμε ως έθνος τα 200 χρόνια από την ελληνική εθνική επανάσταση, αλλά και σε λίγες μέρες την εθνική μας μια εθνική γιορτή την 28η Οκτωβρίου. Θέλω να ευχηθώ καλή επιτυχία σε αυτό το σημαντικό συνέδριο και τα συμπεράσματά σας να είναι χρήσιμα και κρίσιμα σε αυτή την εποχή που ζούμε, που είναι με πολλά προβλήματα και πολλές αοριστείες. Σας ευχαριστώ θερμά.
Welcoming address by the President of the International Commission for the History of Representative and Parliamentary Institutions, Professor Joseba Agorezanaga.
Thank you. Good afternoon. First of all, I would like to thank the President of the Hellenic Republic, Katerina Sakellaropoulou, because this conference is under the patronage of the Republic, of the Hellenic Republic. And later the rector of this university, Athanasios Dimopoulos, because the University of Athens is hosting this celebration of this 72nd Conference of International Commission of the History of Representative Assemblies, Parliamentary Institutions. I also like to thank the Deputy President of the Hellenic Parliament, because your work are important for us and is very connected with our work, with our academic work. And also many thanks to our national convener, Georgia Karbunaki, for their courage and commitment in organizing these conferences, difficult this time. And also for the former president of our commission, Maria Sofia Corchulo, because I know that you are in the origin, the real origin of this 72nd conference, because you was very committed and interested in organizing one conference in Athens. You are the former president, honorary president of our commissions, and very important, active, and permanent, with permanent contribution. Thank you, Maria Sofia. And it is a honor for our commission to hold the 72nd conference in the emblematic and important references of Athens. We are all aware of the difficulty to participate in person in academic meetings and conferences, and for this reason, our appreciation and gratitude to all the members of the commissions that are here in person participating in these conferences. Many thanks for all members of the International Commission here participating in these conferences. In 2019, in Andorra, we approved the organization of these conferences in Athens, which was to be the 73rd conference, but it is finally the 72nd. This commission was founded 85 years ago, in 1936, as a commission extérieure of the Comité International des Sciences Historiques, a transnational organization of historians. The origin and birth of this commission was related to one comparative research project presented in Warsaw during the 7th International Conference of Historians in 1933 by Émile Luce and François-Olivier Martin. The research project was to analyze in comparative perspective the origin and development of the Assemblée d'État prior to later liberal parliaments. And in 1936, at the 8th International Conference of Historians in Bucharest, the project was accepted and it was founded the Commission Internationale pour l'Histoire des Assemblées d'État. But later, after the Second World War, in 1950, in the International Conference in Paris, 1950, the new president, Helen Montcalm, was in favor of the extension of our researches to periods later than the end of the Ancien Régime, originally indicated as the our terminus ad quem. She, Helen, proposed a new name in English, changing a little bit. The International Commission for the History of Representative and Parliamentary Institutions. And this was adopted in order to emphasize the history of parliamentarism. Global reflections is the great challenges facing the historians of the 21st century, but activities are always developed on the local scale. The origin and the development of the representative assemblies in Europe is a characteristic and main element of European political culture and civilization. The belief or myth concerning the community as the subject of political power is a specific characteristic of the European political culture. And this idea is connected with the ancient classical civilization of Athens and the Hellenic civilization. Finally, two words of admiration about Athens and civilization that more than 1,000 years promoted the various polities of the Aegean Sea in dialogue and continuous change with the Empire of Persians. Herodotus, our references, after fighting against Persians, tried to understand the foundation and the knowledge of the Persians and gave an exceptional teaching to all historians, practicing analysis and empathy, even with his enemy, to test ways of approaching to new knowledge and truth. The isonomy of Herodotus refers to the promotion and the need to stimulate equality, isos equality, and nomos castan leo. Equality of the citizens of the polis for the organization of the community. Equality is at the base of the organization of the demos, the community, of the citizens participating in the assembly. Herodotus and Thucydides continue to be references for the 21st century historian. But we know also that during the Hellenistic period, Pyrrhus of Elysea denied the possibility of knowledge and the truth, promoting the Pyrrhonism or radical skepticism. They are concerned for all us also in the present days, this kind of reflection, this kind of the debate between Herodotus, Thucydides tradition, and Pyrrhus of Elysea. These conferences raise an ambitious program, and among the topics of the debate are the contribution of transnational liberalism to the national liberal movement, for instance, in Greeks 200 years ago. This transnational liberalism is important. Why? Because after the organization of the Congress of Vienna, more than 200 European political entities organized the new political order in Europe, and the Greek powers will take common responsibility for the general peace and stability in Europe in 1815. However, civil wars within the monarchies, these imperial monarchies, increased due to the growing and strength of the liberalism. The idea of the war as a positive value, in particular, wars of national liberalism to establish liberalism, spread among the bourgeoisie and the popular classes. Liberal revolts in Spain, with success in 1820, revolts in Italy against Austria in 1820s, the War of Independence in Greece against the Ottomans. War was nourished by a new myth, the patriotic myth of liberation embodied in political liberalism. This myth will continue with the fighting of the barricades in 1848 and the Paris Commune, the 1871. The success of the liberal revolution in Spain in 1820 generated a new hope in transnational liberalism and directly influences the liberal revolution in Portugal, Naples, Piedmont, and the Decembrists in Russia, and also in Greece. That are topics of our these conferences, different topics. Transnational liberalism successfully took off on the continent of Europe. This is some topics. That's why congratulations for the organization, because we have very interesting topics, and I am sure that this conference will be very interesting in contribution to analyze this view about transnational liberalism, because we are international commission. That's why we need also this international view, analyzing local things, local elements, and local problematics. Thanks. And the conference is open, and now we will have a lectio magister by Professor, excuse me, I have the program, this Professor Athanasius. Thank you, Professor Athanasius. Thank you.
Lectio Magistralis by Professor Emeritus of the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens, Thanos Veremis.
Mr. Deputy Speaker of the Greek Parliament, Mr. Rector of the University of Athens, and Mr. President of this session, ladies and gentlemen, this is a great pleasure for me to come back to my old haunts. I have left the university, and I'm always happy to come back and visit. The subject of my lecture is the transition of the Greek War of Independence from pre-modernity to modernity. In other words, since nothing remains as it is in history, everything changes, so did the wars of independence, the American first, the French afterwards, and then finally the Greek War of Independence between 1821 and 1830, I would say, or 31, depending. In the past, historians have stressed the extraordinary aspects of this war, focusing mainly on the attributes of the heroes who brought it about. Marxists have tried to identify the clash of social classes in the strife between warriors and notables. The focus of our attempt to reassess this period will be directed towards the nature of the segmentary. Segments are pieces of a society cut in segments, and this is the term by Professor Gellner, who explains that many of the pre-modern societies are in fact segmentary communities. That made the uprising possible. If the Marxist view of society is one of horizontal class division, our view of the segmented society is based on the vertical divisions that preserved the societal hierarchy in homogeneous networks inimical to each other for the control of the emerging state. In such segmentary societies or communities, it is clientelism and familism that become the necessary mechanisms for connecting each segment with a central government whenever there is a central government, because during the War of Independence, central governments appeared on and off until finally the Greek government was controlled by a president, the first president of Greece, Kapodistrias, Ioannis Kapodistrias. The war broke out in March 1821, and a couple of months before in Romania, under the command of an officer of the Russian army, Alexander Ypsilantis, as well as the Moreas, southern Greece. Whereas the Romanian campaign was suppressed by Ottoman forces, the war of the Peloponnese was crowned by success. In the Battle of Dervenaki, 1822, the Greek commander Theodore Kolokotronis defeated the Ottoman army of 30,000 men, while the fleet, the Greek fleet, comprising ships from the islands of Hydra, Spetses, and Psara, successfully patrolled the Aegean, thereby preventing the landing of Ottoman forces in the Morea. At the same time, the rough terrain of the hinterland was ideally suited to the guerrilla warfare tactics of the insurgents. Following the success of the first 2 years, however, the Greeks turned against each other as segmentary communities. Some Greeks believe that it is written in our DNA to fight against each other. Not so, not so. There is hardly any other revolution or war of independence without its own civil war. I dare say the Americans had their civil war in the midst of their war of independence, hence the existence of Canada. Canada consists of those Americans who were friendly to the crown, to the British crown, and left their country and sought refuge in Canada. And of course, the French Revolution is a story of many, many civil wars within the initial uprising. So we should not consider our own case extraordinary. I think most of these wars of independence contain civil wars in the final analysis because they are really after power of an emerging state. And power is always conducive to civil wars. The transition of Ottoman despotism into a unitary state based on the prototype of post-revolutionary France started during the initial years of the Greek Revolution. The First National Assembly in Epidaurus, 1822, produced a constitution that established the principles of the representative democracy that was to emerge in the future. Public administration was founded entirely on the French model of governance. The designation Hellas, which we use today to describe our own country, emerged during the War of Independence and revealed the self-chosen identity of a Christian Orthodox community with a linguistic tradition that spanned millennia. The term Hellas had never been used before to signify a single political entity. The spread of Christianity owed much to the Greek language, and the ecumenical patriarchate in Constantinople adopted it as an instrument of religious education. I would remind the audience that the 3 out of the 4 Gospels were written in Greek directly, the 4th in Aramaic, translated subsequently in Greek. The new state not only chose to Hellenize its name, it also based its national education system on the ancient heritage of Hellenism. The year 1821, therefore, not only signifies the beginning of the Greek nation-state, it also constitutes a reservoir of heroic action and merit. People sometimes wonder why I use the term merit. I think it's a useful term because most of these war heroes were people of merit. In other words, they were outcomes of natural selection. When the issue is life or death, people tend to excel, and those who do excel have merit. In that sense, I think most of these heroes did have merit and inspired subsequent generations with their example. Throughout the 2 centuries that have elapsed since then, the great event became an idealized rendition of the early history of the Greek state. The preponderant society of the War of Independence was eventually ushered into modernization. The route to this transformation went through the avenues of commerce between East and West. There is a wonderful book written by a Serb-American scholar called Trajan Stojanovic, and the title is The Conquering Orthodox Balkan Merchant. In other words, the route of the works of merchants was also the route of ideas that came from the West to the East and inspired the War of Independence. Within a decade of war, social entities of pre-modernity, segmented by familial institutions, client-based networks, and ties of loyalty, started to acquire a modern identity instead of an exclusive loyalty, hitherto reserved for the family, village, or place of birth. Modern identity turned to the abstraction of an imagined community, that of the nation. The nation, as we know it today, is also called an imagined community by none other than Benedict Anderson, the author of a wonderful book called Imagined Communities, published in 1983, or maybe before that, and became, I think, a leading analysis of how people turn into nations after a long word with wars of independence. The first civil war, which occurred within the War of Independence in the autumn of 1823, summer of 1824, was waged between primates and warlords, whereas the second, July 1824, January 1825, was a clash between the insurgents of Roumeli, central Greece, with aid from the island of Hydra against the representatives of the Peloponnese, southern Greece, in other terms. The landing of the regular Egyptian forces under Ibrahim, son of Muhammad Ali, hegemon of Egypt, and the resulting devastation in the Peloponnese effectively put an end to the war among Greeks. The appointment by the National Assembly of Trizina of the former Foreign Affairs Minister of Russia, Ioannis Kapodistrias, as the first head of government was the starting point of a generally accepted leadership for the revolution and the establishment of a unitary state authority. The same is true among the many authors of memoirs during the War of Independence. Few were intellectuals of any caliber, and most display varying degrees of literary skill. George Tertsetis, a literary figure who tutored the Greek poet of the national anthem, Dionysius Solomos, in the Greek language, because he had an Italian education originally, will also be remembered for scripting the memoirs of Theodore Kolokotronis, the old man of Moreas, the major warlord of the War of Independence, who gave a full account of his exploits to the poet from Zante. Although the description of his key triumph at the Battle of Dervenakia is somewhat terse, Kolokotronis devotes pages to describe details of secondary importance that nevertheless provide ample information about his times. The memoirs of Nikolaos Spiliadis appeared in 2007, published in a new edition of 6 volumes by Panagiotis Christopoulos. The author relied mainly on his school education in order to master his very competent formal Greek. He describes the disaster of the defeat of the Philhellenes at the Battle of Peta in northwestern Greece in skillful detail. In contrast to the more spontaneous accounts of Fotakos and Kasomoulis, other writers of memoirs, Spiliadis often reminds his readers of school teachers who revert to exclamatory remarks when recalling the bravery of the Philhellenes or the savagery of the opponents. Meanwhile, the unlettered Ioannis Makrigiannis was the most celebrated figure among the warrior historians, lauded by such prominent Greek literary figures as Georgios Seferis, the Nobel Prize winner in poetry, and Theotokos for his primitive style of expression. Makrigiannis appeals to a contemporary reading public, irrespective of the right or left leanings of this public. He constantly aggrieves against those in power and always feels he has been sidetracked and sidewinded during the War of Independence. A readership that shares his culture of the underdog will often take him at his word. Thus, when he summons his compatriots to abandon their selfish aims in favor of a united brotherhood, historically he is in fact writing in the midst of a civil war, during which he was an unabashed defender of one side against the other. The rector and I, as Peloponnesians, are not happy with the account of Makrianis, who comes from central Greece and has a very strong affiliation with his place of origin. Deciphering pre-modernity from modernity in the writings of Makrianis will become the task of many future scholars, I think. There is much to be found there, and much which has been neglected, I think. Yannis Vlachogiannis was a historian and a literary figure who made it possible for many of the writers of memoirs to come to the fore, to appear in printed form for the public, in formal Greek mostly, but with the exception of Makrianis' memoirs, written in his own native language, much of the rest has been doctored somehow. And Vlachogiannis deplores this invented sort of language of some of the better people of their generation in writing their memoirs. Having discussed works by native authors with regard to the War of Independence between 1821 and 1831, it is necessary to consider the views in perspective. It becomes increasingly clear that the identification of most writers with the birthplace, family bonds, and religious affiliations constitutes the main sources of their loyalty. Until the newborn nation-state acquired a firm base in society, thanks to the revolutionary agents of the diaspora, pre-modernity would reign unopposed in most institutions of this segmented society. The civil war waged between the Greek factions that I already mentioned allowed the Ibrahim Pasha to prepare his assault in the Peloponnese in exchange for Crete in time, and in time the Peloponnese itself. This predicament compelled the revolutionaries to seek a centralized authority that would bring unity to their cause. The absence of a generally accepted leadership was a shortcoming of the revolution from the very beginning. It appeared that the transition of Greece to modernity required a considerable degree of centralization. Thus, the unification of a segmented effort was secured, and the new state could henceforth advance towards a liberal stage of development. Ernest Gellner achieved not only the best definition of nationalism for which he is remembered, but also the formulation of a pre-modern politics in segmented societies, such as our own during the War of Independence, which he analyzed in such compelling terms. Traditional man can sometimes escape the tyranny of kings, but only at the cost of falling under the tyranny of cousins and of ritual. The king defined and virtually orchestrated severely demanding and life-pervading systems may indeed succeed, at least for a time, in avoiding tyrannical centralization, but only at the cost of a most demanding culture, one which modern man would find intolerably stifling. The segmentary community we have already described might avoid central tyranny by turning the individual into an integral part of the social sub-unit. Such are the words of Ernest Gellner, a Czech intellectual and historian who lived and worked in England for most of his life and left some words of wisdom. Segmentary communities may describe the preponderance of their members' loyalty to the family and their birthplace rather than the state that collected their taxes. In such communities, identity was not chosen by the individual, but ascribed by others, mainly the family. When referring to traditional Greek individualism, it would be wiser to insert the prefix collective individualism. Despite all the changes that have taken place in Greek society, collective individualism persists to this day. The relocation of the Greek population from the unhealthy lowlands to the mountain communities during the late 18th century brought many Christians out of Ottoman control. These communities took to animal husbandry, while the consolidation of property in the lowlands led to the formation of large estates. In 1820, the rebellion of Ali Pasha of Yanina in western Greece of today against the Sultan rendered the Greek warlords valuable to both sides of the conflict. As captains of Aspropotamos, the family of Stournari controlled at least 120 villages with an average of 70 family inhabitants in each, as well as owning 7,000 to 8,000 heads of animals, sheep, goats, cattle, and horses. He fought on the side of the besieged Greeks of Messaloniki, the Nikolaos Stournaris, the patriarch of the family, and died in the heroic exodus from the city. Before Greek society acquired the cultural homogeneity ascribed to it by historian Constantine Paparigopoulos, its uniformity as a nation-state administered by King Otto under the revolution banner was at the very least questionable. This is not to say that only the armatols, the primates, and the clergy were of one mind, but that each one of these groups possessed a plethora of blueprints for the revolution and its outcome. The message of the Philiki Eteria, a secret society which worked in the background, promising freedom from tyrannical rule, was deliberately vague so that each recipient of its promise could add his own version to the bottom line. According to another writer of memoirs, Perevos, the Souliots, who formed an insular confederation of villages consisting of mercenary warriors, aspired to freedom from central Ottoman rule and its Pasha overlords. The freedom to establish the price of their mercenary service was mainly determined by Ali Pasha, the Albanian warlord of Yanina. The dispersion of the Souliots and their family-based communities rendered them champions of the Greek cause and ultimately suppliers of officers for the regular forces of Greece. The Souliots entered the war 8 months before the uprising of the Moreas of southern Greece, were initially recruited by Ismail Paşa Bey to fight Ali Pasha, and then they turned against the Sultan. They became allies of Ali Pasha. After returning to the village in Suli, to their villages, from exile in Corfu, they realized that the Albanian allies of the Grand Porte considered them equally as their enemies. Therefore, they decided to join their traditional foe, Ali Pasha, because he promised them their homeland and also paid their wages. We find evidence that the first president of Greece, Kapodistrian, as to the nature of the Greek nation in his correspondence prior to his return to Greece in October 1827. And he says, Kapodistrian writes, "The Greek nation consists of people who have continued to practice their faith and speak its language since the fall of Constantinople. This cultural approach combines religion and language, and at the same time gives credit to both paragons of Greek identity, for keeping the Greeks aware of their history and foundations. Kapodistrian was a political conservative who accepted aspects of the Enlightenment concerning the formation of a unitary state. There was never a word for the making of a federation or even less of a confederation in Greece. It was always a unitary state that preoccupied the Greek state builders, so to speak. Greek nationalism was developed as a concept by historian Constantine Paparigopoulos, that I've already mentioned, several years after the end of the War of Independence, whereas Adamantios Korais, the par excellence voice of the Enlightenment, attributed the origin of the nation entirely to antiquity, to ancient Greece, and its historic continuity between ancient, medieval, and modern Greece. His was an ideology of unity based entirely on cultural rather than the racial elements. Meanwhile, progress in the natural sciences in the West was indirectly responsible for the racial theories of J.P. Fallmerayer, a German scholar who believed that there was no continuity in the Greek population. And although this created an outcry in most of the Greeks, Constantine Paparigopoulos came up with a much more credible theory of unity, culture. And he said, blood doesn't talk, languages speak, cultures will attest to what people are. And I think this brings us very much closer to our contemporary idea of a nation, rather than the original biologically based on blood and soil and whatever. I think this is one probably of the greater achievements of the War of Independence, the existence, the production of ideas such as this, that it is culture, in fact, that makes a nation. And I think this is really very close to what we feel today. Thank you very much.
End of the opening ceremony of the conference. Thank you very much for your participation. A coffee break will be offered in the amphitheater Alkis Argyriadis. The members of the Secretariat at the entrance of this hall will guide you to the amphitheater. Thank you very much.
Well, close please the door. Close the door, please. Good afternoon. We are in the plenary session, and the first talk was given by Jonathan Hall. Jonathan Hall is full professor at the University of Chicago, United States. Thank you for your long term and your long commitment with these conferences. And the title is Between Revolution and Civil War, The View from Argos. Jonathan is member of the Classic and History Department, and in the future, he is preparing a new book about looking the past, about the past. Thank you, Jonathan, for your contribution, for your commitment with this event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Giras Chronaga. Ευχαριστώ επίσης πολύ την οργανωτική επιστολή για την τιμητική πρόσκληση Χαίρομαι πάρα πολύ που επιστρέφω επιτέλους στην Ελλάδα. I want to provide a local perspective on two specific events of the Greek Revolutionary War. And my material is drawn from the book that Professor Agiris mentioned, entitled Reclaiming the Past, which will be published on November the 5th. This examines the biography of the town of Argos in the Peloponnese, as well as the town's relationship with its archaeological heritage. By way of introduction, it's worth pointing out that Argos lacked the strategic importance of nearby Nafplio, mainly because it was not easily defensible. Unlike Nafplio, there were no city walls, and the medieval fortifications on the Larissa Hill, this was also the ancient Acropolis, had long lain in ruins. And this is why on March the 23rd, 1821, when the uprising first broke out at Argos, yes, 2 days before the Evangelismos, the Turkish population, which never constituted more than 25%, immediately abandoned Argos for the relative safety of Nafplio. I should state that all of the dates I'm giving today are old-style Julian calendar dates. Argos did, however, dominate the Argive plain, which any army from the north or west had to cross to reach Nafplio. So those of you who are going on the day trip to Nafplio on Saturday will be able to wave at Argos as we zip past it on the bus on the other side of the plain. So its location, in combination with its indefensibility, meant that it was the target of enemy attack on no fewer than 3 occasions. First by the Kihaya Mustafa Bey in April 1821, then by Mahmud Pasha Dramalis in July 1822, and finally by Ibrahim Pasha of Egypt in June 1825. But Argos also played a notable role in the complex and often confused efforts to establish a provisional government for the liberated territories. Indeed, after plague broke out at Tripolitsa, the former Ottoman capital of the Morea, in October of 1821, the Archistratigos Demetrios Ypsilandis planned to convene the first National Assembly at Argos in December. It was only after several massed bands began converging on the town, and all this was complicated by the assassination of the Idriot captain Adonis Ikonomou, that the assembly was rescheduled for January 1822 at a quieter location near Epidavros. Despite the horrific massacre on Chios in the spring of 1822 and a defeat at Petta in July, the Greeks could count a number of successes in the first 2 years of the revolution. These included the liberation of much of the Peloponnese, including the capture of Kalamata, Monovasia, Navarino, and Nafplio, the decimation of Dramalis' army and the sinking of the Ottoman flagship, and the capture of Athens for the first time. In 1823, however, divisions that had been festering beneath the surface were exposed by the fractious Second National Assembly at Astros. As Lord Byron wrote in a letter to his friend John Cam Hobhouse, dated September the 11th, quote, "I must not conceal from you and the committee that the Greeks appear in more danger from their own divisions than from the attacks of the enemy," unquote. The provisions of the Constitution of Epidavros had established a legislative Senate and a 5-person executive committee, which, following an amendment adopted at Astros, was to be appointed by the Senate. The executive of 1823 was dominated by allies of the military chieftain Theodoros Kolokotronis. Indeed, in June, Kolokotronis was himself, somewhat reluctantly, appointed to the 5th vacant position on the committee. The majority of the members of the Senate, by contrast, were fiercely opposed to Kolokotronis, including several high-ranking primates or proesti of the Peloponnese, the leaders of the nautical islands, Ydra, Spetses, Psara, and adherents to the former president of the executive, Alexandros Mavrokordatos. Initially, both the Senate and the executive were meeting in Tripolitsa, and then from July on the island of Salamis. On September the 25th, however, the executive decided to relocate to Nafplio, which was now under the direct control of Kolokotronis' son, Panos. Understandably, perhaps, the Senate was reluctant to follow suit, but it also recognized that it would be cumbersome to transact business with the executive if it remained on Salamis. And for that reason, on October the 10th, the Senate decided to transfer its seat to Argos, 12 kilometers northwest of Nafplio. From there, relations between the two institutional bodies rapidly went downhill. Matters came to a head in the last week of November, when the Senate dismissed from the Executive Committee Kolokotronis' ally, Andreas Metaxas, accusing him of dereliction of duty, and replacing him with Yannis Koletis. The Senate also sacked the finance minister, Karalambis Peroukas, on the charge of having illegally imposed a government monopoly on the sale of salt. In reaction, on November the 26th, the executive sent Panos Kolokotronis, along with his cousin Nikitaras Torkophagos, the Turk eater, and the Argive captain Dimitrios Sokris, at the head of 200 armed men to Argos, in order to, as the British officer Lester Stanhope puts it, explain things to the Senate, and there was obviously an implied threat there. Our accounts differ as to exactly what happened next. Some say that the Senate was in mid-session when the armed soldiers burst in, though others relate that business had been concluded or adjourned to the following day. The Roumeliot captain Yannis Makrianis and Spiridon Trikoupis, who would later serve as independent Greece's first prime minister, both state that many of the senators were abused, threatened, and even assaulted by the men sent by the executive. Nearly all our accounts record that Nikitaras' men seized the Senate archives. The one notable exception is Kolokotronis, who maintains that Theodoros Sakellaropoulos, the sergeant-at-arms for the Senate, but also Nikitaras' brother-in-law, refused to hand over the archives. But Kolokotronis' account is unsatisfactory because he is clearly at pains to minimize his involvement in the episode. And an anonymous letter in the possession of the Argive Danaos Society, written from Laloukas, a village to the east of Argos, just 2 days after the event, makes it clear that the archives, together with minutes of previous meetings and a copy of the laws, were in fact taken by the soldiers. A more complicated version is provided by Kolokotronis' adjutant, Fotakos. Fotakos writes that Zacharopoulos, whose loyalty was automatically assumed on account of his family ties to Nikitaras, was indeed entrusted by the executive with the confiscated archives, but then handed them back to the senators, an act of treason that, in Fotakos' mind, explained Zacharopoulos' mysterious illness and death shortly afterwards. Several of our accounts relate that on the evening of the assault on the Senate, Nikitaras' men rampaged through the town of Argos, ransacking several senators' homes. As a result, the majority of senators decided to abandon Argos. On November 30th, they embarked on boats at Mili and sailed to Kranidi in the eastern Argolid, where they appointed a new executive committee under the presidency of Georgios Koundouriotis. This concluded Argos' role in the affair, although this first civil war would not be over until Panos Kolokotronis surrendered Nafplio to the government in June 1824. And I think we'll probably hear more about these events on Friday morning with the papers by Professors Hatsis and Papaspirou. But I want to return briefly to the catalyst for the events of November the 26th. Metaxas had been expelled from the executive on the grounds that he had been absent from Nafplio for more than 5 days while dealing with an interfamily feud at Akava, where he also met up with Kolokotronis. Petrobe Mavromikalis, the president of the executive, was also away from Nafplio on business, but this meant that the executive had been governing with only 2 of its members present, short of the required quorum of 3 and a violation of the Constitution. For its part, the executive argued that the dismissal of the ministers was also illegal because the Constitution required 2/3 of the Senate to be present to enact legislation. However, by late November, 11 senators had defected and joined the executive in Nafplio, while others were simply absent, meaning that the legislators fell just short of the necessary quorum of 47 out of 70 members. Evidently, the key issue here was one of legitimacy. And this, as Nikolaos Spiliadis already recognized, accounts for the importance of the archives. It was their possession of the archives, and Spiliadis adds the official seal of state, that allowed the senators to claim that they were the legitimate authority. And that is also why Nikitaris' men sought to confiscate the selfsame archives. As envisioned by the Constitution of Epidavros, the executive and the Senate were expected to work in full cooperation. But in these conditions of deadlock, which body could legitimately claim to represent the provisional government of Greece? That would be a question of the utmost importance at any time, but it was especially critical towards the end of 1823 because of the anticipation of a significant loan from the London Greek Committee, I should say. In September, Byron explained to the committee's secretary, Bowring, that he could only deal with the legitimate government, but was at a loss as to who spoke for the government, especially since his primary contact, Mavrokordatos, had departed for the island of Hydra. And this, of course, is one of the reasons why Byron remained so long on Kefalonia before crossing to Messaloniki in January 1824. Similarly, in December, Stanhope, who was serving as the chief liaison between Byron, the London Greek Committee, and the Greeks, decided to postpone his proposed visit to Nafplio because he did not want to be seen to be siding with a particular faction. In reality, though, British observers were in no doubt as to where their political sympathies lay. As Stanhope wrote, quote, "Lord Byron, Colonel Napier, all in fact concur in representing the executive body as devoid of public virtue and actuated by avarice or low ambition. The legislative body have always acted with great discretion," end of quote. Likewise, the Scottish Philhellene and volunteer Thomas Gordon writes, quote, "With perhaps the exception of Zaimis, the members of the executive were no better than public robbers, while the majority of the legislators, clinging to Mavrokordatos' system, gave proofs, at least in their collective capacity, of patriotism and a love of order," unquote. Commentators have sometimes faulted Kolokotronis for the clumsiness with which he handled the events that precipitated the First Civil War. But he had learned a vital lesson regarding the importance of international validation, as events from 6 years later would reveal. Ioannis Kapodistrian had been appointed provisional governor of Greece at the Third National Assembly at Damalas, modern Trezina, in April 1827, arriving in Greece in January 1828, although unsettled conditions in Nafplio meant that he did not establish his base there until October. And of course, the statue that you see on the screen is the one that sits outside this building. Within just a few months, Kapodistrias's authoritarian tendencies had already won him many enemies. As George Finlay notes, his arbitrary conduct created a constitutional opposition to his administration, and while he was popular in the Peloponnese because of his support for a French expeditionary force to expel Ibrahim's army, quote, he wished to silence all opposition, and he adopted many violent and illegal measures to exclude every man whom he deemed a liberal, end of quote. Kolokotronis, however, was not among Kapodistrias's enemies. In part, this was because Kolokotronis supported the Russian party and entertained the hope that Kapodistrias's distinguished service in the Russian government would win him Tsar Nicholas's favor. In order to, as Finlay puts it, give a sanction to his dictatorial power, Kapodistrias decided to convene a fourth National Assembly to be held at Argos in July 1829. According to Kolokotronis' memoirs, Kapodistrias had originally planned to hold the assembly in a garden or an orchard, like the three previous National Assemblies. Kolokotronis, however, persuaded the governor that the Hellenistic theatre near the Church of the Dormition of the Virgin in the southern zone of Argos would be a far more appropriate venue. The cavea of the ancient theatre had been a continuously visible remnant of the past in the urban landscape of Argos. The French emissary André de Monceau seems to have been the first to describe it in 1669, after which it became an obligatory stop on every Western traveller's tour of Argos. In 1811, Veli Pasha, Ottoman governor of the Morea and son of Ali of Yanina, conducted excavations there and removed a number of statues. And it may not surprise you to learn that a statue group of Zeus and Leda, which was excavated by Veli Pasha, is now in the custody of the British Museum. Kolokotronis' suggestion to repurpose the Hellenistic theatre as the venue for the Fourth National Assembly was based on more than just functional convenience. When Kapodistrias worried about the expense involved, Kolokotronis is supposed to have replied, "Let the expense be made, because people come from Europe and pay money to look at those stones, and it will be an honor to me for us to clean up those stones and display them and hold our assembly." Much has been written, including by Professor Veremis, about how Hellenic antiquity was co-opted to serve as a nation-building charter by intellectuals of the Greek Enlightenment. Now, Kolokotronis, of course, even by his own admission, was hardly an intellectual. He does profess an interest in history, but his juxtaposition of the three names that he does single out from the history of Greece, namely the almost certainly pseudo-historical Aristomenes of Messene, the early 5th century BCE Spartan queen Gorgo, and the 15th century Albanian hero Skanderbeg, betray an unmistakably folkloric understanding of the past. At the same time, however, Kolokotronis was acutely aware of the symbolic importance of ancient remains to those Western Europeans whose moral, political, and financial support was so essential for the Greek cause. Furthermore, to use the terminology of the Harvard anthropologist Michael Hertzfeld, Kolokotronis succeeded in transforming the notion of cultural heritage, at least as conceived by Western outsiders and Greek intellectuals, into a more pragmatic concern with filial inheritance, a type of dowry or common trust whose beneficiaries should at least be able to make real use of it. Indeed, the staging of the event had its desired effect. Kapodistrias, dressed in a Russian military uniform, stepped forward to address the delegates from a wooden pavilion that had been constructed in the orchestra of the theatre. Abel Blouet, the director of the architectural section of the French scientific expedition to the Morea, which had accompanied the French Army of Liberation, witnessed the opening ceremony. noting that it was a fine spectacle to see Greece, after so many centuries of despotism and servitude, liberated from its chains and protected by the great powers of Europe, assemble in the ancient theatre of Argos under the presidency of a skillful diplomat. Although Finlay complained that the proceedings of the Fourth National Assembly were opposed to the free spirit of the national assemblies of the earlier period of the Greek Revolution, Kolokotronis himself wrote that the Assembly's votes set the basis for a constitutional government, while Trikoupis, who confirms the importance of the Assembly for placating the great powers, regarded it as a great success on Kapodistrias's part. In the end, of course, the apparent consensus was a fiction, but the point I want to make is that the event demonstrates that appeals to the cultural heritage of Greek antiquity were not only the preserve of an intellectual class. And this, I think, complicates the now conventional dichotomy that is drawn between the Hellenic and the Romaic aspects of Greek identity in the 19th century. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonathan, for your talk. And next, Evanthis Hatzifasin-Lou, professor of the Department of History at the University of Athens, and involved in 20th century view about Soviet Union by Western country. That's one of the book of Evanthis, but now the topic will be about between the revolution and the coup d'etat, patterns of the political change in post-Napoleonic Europe. Thank you, Evanthis.
Well, let me say that compared to the excellent presentation by the previous speaker, we seem to be between the revolution and the coup d'etat and between the revolution and the civil war, which is seems to be kind of very common categories. Thank you, Mr. President. Ladies and gentlemen, in my paper, I will discuss the relative impact of revolutions and coups in Europe from the middle of the 19th century until 1917. I will argue that although the frequent revolutions of that era were events of a gigantic scale, they rarely were fully successful. And it often happened that, rather ironically, the outcome of a grand revolution was finally decided by a bold and well-organized coup d'etat. Allow me to start by admitting that this differentiation between revolutions and coups d'etats seems to be somehow arbitrary. Well, it's not perhaps the place to start discussion about definitions, but what is indeed needed for a political and social event to be recognized as a revolution? If popular participation is a necessary ingredient, how many people must participate in it in order to be able to use the term? I would propose to adopt a functional approach. I will treat the revolution as an uprising that requires the participation of large masses, but it is not necessary that these masses should form a majority of the people in a society. And although a measure of spontaneity is also required, the mobilization from below should not necessarily exclude the possibility that a revolution may also have been organized by leadership, at least to some extent. Still, it is important to remember that popular participation and the resulting passions usually means that, as in war, the planning for a revolution rarely survives first contact with the enemy. Regarding coups, I will refer mostly to military coups rather than the unlawful, sudden, but peaceful initiative of the head of state. As we know, the military coup is the undertaking of a small and determined group of leaders, therefore members of the elite, Compared to a revolution, it is more focused and well-organized and reflects the more or less comprehensive aims of smaller groups with good internal communications. Usually, in Europe of the 19th century, it was easier to organize coups if one had the support of the army or crucial sections of the army, for example, the palace guard or the guard of the capital. Still, it also helped if the putschists could also provoke a degree of popular mobilization, provided that this popular mobilization would not sweep away or overtake the plans of the conspirators. Last but not least, it is important to note that this differentiation between revolutions and coups was not really so clear at that time. During the 19th century, the notion of the coup rarely existed, with the exception of the palace coup, namely the overthrow of one elite group by another. At that time, all upheavals, mostly upheavals with some popular participation, were usually described as revolutions. The 19th century was the time of the twilight of the Ancien Regime, when every attempt at overthrow or subversion was termed revolution, from the model of the hated French one, the Nightmare of Metternich. In fact, almost all the events to which I will refer in my paper were called at that time revolutions, but not all were really such. I will argue that only when representative democracy became a European canon, therefore very lately in European history, was this differentiation between revolutions and coups definitely accepted. Now let me start with revolutions. As we all know, there is this change of grand events from the late 18th century until the early 20th century. The American Revolution, the French, the ones in Southern Europe, the Greek was one of them, the Latin American ones, the July Revolution in Paris, and upheavals and rebellions in the 1830s, the huge, almost pan-European revolutionary upheaval of 1848. I would go as far as describing the Italian unification in the 1860s as a kind of a revolution, although I confess that there are elements in the Risorgimento that could dispute this interpretation. I will also discuss the February 1917 Russian Revolution as an event of this kind. I will not deal with the Paris Commune. I think this is not a revolution, it's a local uprising, or with more contemporary events such as the Iranian Revolution, the Velvet Revolutions in Eastern Europe, or the Arab Spring. Now, from 1776 until the early 20th century, there seems to be a thread uniting these major events and forming their intellectual basis. This was the time when popular mobilization sought to achieve two interconnected aims: liberal democratic or representative governance, and, in most cases, national liberation. They seem to be the two sides of the same coin at that time. I am dealing, in other words, with liberal revolutions. Now, the largest problem of 19th century revolutions were their level of success. Well, again, trying to measure political success is not an easy thing. The point here is that relatively few of these revolutions really prevailed. Among them, only the American, the Greek, the Latin American mobilizations, while the French one of 1848 and the Russian one of 1917 had bitter endings. The mother of all revolutions, the French one of 1789, led to a sui generis polity, the First Empire, and was finally suppressed. In fact, there is a huge list of suppressed mobilizations throughout Europe of that time. It is difficult for me to resist the thought that most successful revolutions were those that also functioned as wars of national liberation. Not all of them were successful. The European upheavals of 1848 form a good example, but the revolutions with more conventional political and social rather than national aspirations seem to be dealt with more easily by the Ancien Regime. Now, it would not be a novelty to point out that the huge specter of forces that converged into a big revolution gave it an initial impetus, but usually also led to painful internal dissensions and loss of focus. In other words, the problem was the inevitably low level of organization and the difficulty in agreeing into a coherent course of action after their initial or seeming prevalence, which in a way unleashed conflicts within the revolutionaries over the various possibilities of future courses. Almost all revolutions suffered from this. The French one in the late 18th century is the most striking example, but as we heard before, the Greek Revolution in the 1820s also went through successive civil wars. Another painful example was, of course, the painful disagreements that occurred during the German Revolution in 1848, which to a large extent led to the fatal, for German history, defeat of the liberalism of the Frankfurt National Assembly. Let me recall that the verses of the German national anthem about the need to have Germany above all were written then as a liberal, revolutionary, but also desperate protest because unification was not the first priority of the monarchs of that time, and it is debatable, really, if it was the first priority of the liberals that sang the song in 1848. Why then were national liberal revolutions more successful? I tend to accept the view that perhaps it was the aim of national liberation pointing to a foreign enemy, more focused and clear than designs of political and social organization. It is this nature of these events that managed to help revolutionaries with differing political aims to overcome these differences. In this respect, I would like to note my surprise at the cohesion and comprehensiveness of the leadership of the American Revolution. I think that the Americans, the first revolutionaries, were the most successful of all. I'm also being impressed by the comprehensiveness of the coalition of Garibaldi and Cavour in mid-century Italy. Was it then easy to suppress a revolution? I must say that it was not. Perhaps one could do it in its initial stages when the brutality of the suppression could prevent large crowds from joining in. As we all know, the admirable urban planning of today's Paris, the work of Baron Haussmann during the Second Empire, had as one of its prime aims to provide straight lines for fire for the artillery and for the charge of the cavalry in case of disturbances, of which Paris had seen so many. Let me also remind you that the disturbances of 1968 took place in that part of the city that had not been renovated. Now, having made these observations, it follows that the major issue in the course of suppression was the control of the army. When regimes managed to retain control of the army, as the Prussians did and as the Austrians partially did in 1848, suppression was possible. On the contrary, when the army was not loyal, it was the kiss of death for the regime. In Petrograd in February 1917, it was crucial that the city garrison, including the famous Preobrazhensky Guard Regiment, refused to fire on the protesters and practically joined them. And ironically, it was in Moscow of August 1991, the fact that the tank crews did not respond violently to the popular protests of that coup brought the communist regime to a definite end. Let me now turn to military coups. As I said before, the line between a military coup and a revolution was blurred at that time. However, the major characteristic of coups is their effectiveness. The French Revolution had lost its pace under the Terror and the Directory when Napoleon assumed power through a coup in 1799 on the famous 18th Brumaire. Then the French Revolution evolved into a strange polity based theoretically on liberal principles, but less and less democratic until Napoleon's proclamation as emperor. Napoleon's nephew also staged a coup that gave the fatal blow to the Second Republic in 1851 and assumed the imperial throne next year. It is indeed painful to note that the two big French revolutions were practically settled by coups in which the Bonaparte family seemed to excel. The most telling example was, of course, the so-called Russian October Revolution. Increasingly, international scholarship points out that while the so-called bourgeois revolution of February 1917 was a genuine revolution, the October 1917 event was a carefully staged coup, which indeed succeeded regardless of the famous assault on the Winter Palace, which Bolshevik propaganda only later elevated to an event of gigantically symbolic proportions. Now, with your permission, I will not resist the temptation to make some comments regarding Greek constitutional history. In Athens in 1843, King Otto was forced to concede a constitution by an event often described as the Revolution of the 3rd of September, but which in effect was a military coup by the palace guard with some popular backing. In fact, the protesters gathered that day, 3rd of September 1843, in front of the palace, in the square in front of the palace, which is now called Constitution Square, is the central square of Athens, which you may have noticed in the city. The same could be argued about the anti-Ottonian so-called October Revolution of 1862, or the Greek Goudi Revolution of 1909, which were again a military coup, the first, and the pronunciamento, the second. Still, none of these coups led to a military regime. This happened, the founding of a military regime in Greece, took place with the so-called Revolution of the Army and the Navy in 1922, following Greece's defeat in the war against Kemalist Turkey. This resulted in the first military regime in Greece's history, but it remained in memory as the revolution. And it is exactly that, as the revolution, that that regime described itself. It is ironic, but also indicative of the strength of symbols and words, that this military regime, 1922-1923, remained as a model for future Greek putschists. And the Greek military junta of 1967, the worst military regime in Greek history, described itself as the revolution exactly on the model of their predecessors of 1922. Let me conclude by saying, jokingly of course, that revolutions proved to be a messy affair, much easier and simpler to prevail through a military coup. Arguably, because of their sheer scale, revolutions proved unable to coordinate the aims of the disparate groups that they rallied, whereas coups proved much more able to achieve ambitious yet more focused political aims, although these aims of coups were often of a conservative rather than of a liberal nature. Let us not lose sight of the fact that revolutions and coups were children of the rise of liberal democratic ideas in late modernity. In the 17th century, Louis XIV of France could send the famous D'Artagnan to arrest the similarly famous Fouquet. Nothing happened. There was no popular mobilization. And there were murders of anointed kings throughout Europe in the Middle Ages, in which trade, I must say, the English proved particularly skillful until they executed one of their kings in 1648. There were also in the late Middle Ages and in early modernity a series of local, mostly peasant revolts lacking coherent political aims. But it was only when popular participation and representation received a strong theoretical basis and emerged as a form of governance that revolutions became realistic means for intervention in the political process. By the mid-19th century, the ongoing Industrial Revolution and the rise of mass society had made this an irreversible process. So revolutions and, in fact, often coups in 19th century Europe had political and social references and relevance. They were not merely cases of social bullying by the military, as were the Latin American military coups of the 20th century, or for that matter, the Greek coup of 1967. Still, it is important to note, I have discussed here processes of a past era. We do not now live in Paris of 1832 when barricades were a legitimate reaction to autocracy and when young Gavroche fell so gallantly, as Victor Hugo brilliantly narrated in his Les Miserables. Now we do not need to shoot, we can use ballots. The rise of liberal regimes finally proved irresistible because of economic and social developments, and on the whole, today's liberal democracy vindicates the revolutionaries, not the putschists of the 19th century. Thank you.
Thank you, Evantis, for your contribution. And as Maria Sofia Corciulo, Professor Emeritus of the University La Sapienza, Rome, and Honorary President of our Commission. She is nowadays the real memory of activities in the International Commission. And we are going now to the Magna Graecia, to Naples area. And the title for her contribution is Political Conflicts Inside the Napolitan Parliament in 1820.
Thank you.
In 21st.
I'm especially pleased to take part in this face-to-face conference organized in Athens thanks to the strong and felt engagement of the Greek national convener of our Commission for the History of Representative and Parliamentary Institution, Georgia Karbunaki, with the precious help of National and Kapodistrian University. So I would like to thank also very much the rector, Professor Dimopoulos, and the colleague Atsi Vassiliou and the Vlachopoulos with Professor Veremis. I thank very much all these colleagues. In Italy, in 2020, some academic cultural events were planned to commemorate the historical memory and political institutional legacy of the European revolutions of 1820-21. Demonstration naturally postponed due to the COVID pandemic. It was only on October the 1st, 2020, right before the general lockdowns, that we were able to hold a conference in Naples at the Faculty of Law of Federico II. This date was chosen for its symbolic value as the bicentenary of the Neapolitan Parliament's first assembly in 1820-21, called by King Ferdinando di Borbone, Ferdinando I, in the Church of the Holy Spirit. Here, the president of the chamber, the Italian Chamber of Deputies, Roberto Fico, who was advised by our Secretary General, Mario Di Napoli, wanted to repeat this ceremony, substituting in the role of the king and the dignitaries some students from Vittorio Emanuele First High School, located near to the site where the session of what was the first representative assembly on Italian territory were held. For a number of reasons, which there isn't sufficient time to go into here, this parliament has been almost completely unappraised, if not forgotten, by most Italian historians, with a few rare exceptions in recent years. Yet it was a parliament with extremely interesting political institutional features, quite innovative for the time, having been borrowed in toto from the 1812 Constitution of Cadiz, which the Spanish king at first rejected, but was subsequently forced to adopt in 1820, upon which it took root with enthusiastic, confident fervor in the kingdom of the Two Sicilies. Then, in July 1820, a revolution took place, similar to what would occur in March of 1821 in the Kingdom of Sardinia, under the banner of democratic principles that were never expressed, let alone institutionalized, in the Italian states. A single elective chamber with effectively universal suffrage and the power to legislate, as the king had only a suspensive veto. Moreover, the peripheral state institution answered to the assembly itself. Like planets near the sun, the elected representative bodies at the municipal and the provincial levels revolved around it having a chief say in their administrative and political matters. This latter aspect especially was highly appreciated and coveted by the inhabitants of the kingdom, who were increasingly oppressed by the administrative centralization, which, already heavy under the Bourbon, had been further reinforced and perfected during the decade of Napoleonic domination, 1806-1815. The aspiration for a broader provincial autonomy immediately after the adoption of the Constitution was seconded and shared by the press, which, thanks to the freedom it enjoyed during the so-called nonimestre costituzionale, 33 newspapers were published, frequently reported on this structural arrangement of the kingdom, also in view of the changes the parliament would have to make to the Cadix test to adapt to the Napolitan reality. Either the exponent of the radical and moderate party were agreed at the time about one of the primary aims of the revolutionaries: their wish to obtain autonomous provincial administrative and financial institutions in order to exercise their own local decision-making power, which could be easily communicated to their rulers without having to run the gamut of checks and the filters of the intervening authorities. Especially the eighth was against the Napoleonic Intendente. We now come to our parliament. On 3 separate days, August 20th and 27th and September 3rd, the elections were held on 3 stipulated levels, whose modalities there is insufficient time here to go into. The inhabitants of the kingdom elected the prospective 98 deputies, 72 on the mainland and 26 on the Sicilian islands, which gave birth to the first assembly freely elected by the Napolitan nation. It is certainly interesting to know something about these new deputies. Who were the men this historic task fell to? What was the political path that led them so actively participate in revolutionary development? We can try to draw a single line of interpretation about the makeup of this parliament. In general, most of the elected members across the 3 electoral ranks were chosen mainly on the basis of their culture and background of important political experience and commitment. And those who wished to revamp the obsolete Bourbon status quo were especially appreciated. The average age of many of these deputies was 55, rather old for the standards of the time. However, this meant that they were aged enough to have participated in the events of Napoleon Republic of 1799 and to have later been actively committed to the Napoleonic reformism. Besides these 2 important features, they also adhered to the Carboneria, sect extremely widespread in the provinces, whose aim, as could be read in a contemporary document, was to propagate the constitutional education of the lowest class. The origins of the Carboneria are still obscure. About 70% of the deputies in this parliament were able to check off at least 2 of these boxes. For the high degree of politicization of many deputies, they've been rightly distinguished as very experienced politics because of their know-how and expertise in parliamentary procedure and astuteness, which were useful assets for dealing with an executive made up entirely of expert former collaborators of the Napoleonic regime of Gioacchino Murat. It was the government chaired by Campochiaro, flanked by the Minister for the Interior, Giuseppe Zurlo, who had held prestigious positions during the 1790s as well as in the subsequent Murat period, when he had been appointed Minister of the Interior in 1809. And after Bourbon's return was reconfirmed in this post by the heir to the throne, Prince Francesco, to whom Ferdinando had passed the reins of the kingdom while waiting to attend the Holy Alliance to Ljubljana. There, he would openly dissociate himself from the revolutionary events, which at the time he had wholeheartedly embraced, even swearing an oath to the Constitution. After its inauguration, the Parliament set to work in its chosen headquarters of the Church of San Sebastiano in Naples, placed on the street of the same name, with this circular naveless floor plan, very similar to the San Felipe Neri in Cadiz, where the first Spanish Cortes had been convened in 1812. The most important task facing the Assembly was to reform the PEPA, as the Constitution was familiarly called, since it was proclaimed on March 19, St. Joseph's Day. At the opening of the Prima Legislatura, which would last until January 31, in the Adunanza, as the Assembly session were called, a bill was presented to Parliament, drawn up by the Special Commission for the Provincial and the Municipal Administration. It is in response so that of November 14th of Minister Zurlo's civil administration of the kingdom. Momento. Mi metto gli occhiali. Non vedo. Sorry, just a moment. Zurlo would like to confirm them the existing outlying institution with the new institution of the Constitution of Cadix. The problem was that Zurlo wanted to stay, to maintain the old institution, Napoleonic institution, like intendant and the council, the provincial council, that were formed by dignitaries very loyal with the king. Instead, the new parliament would like to cancel this intendente and to let only elective institution, which named Deputazione. There is a big conflict between these different opinions. The conflict between the executive and the assembly was extremely bitter and lasted from January 8 to 28 to 1821. Zurlo was the major opponent to granting the administrative and policy function exclusively to a collegial body like Deputazione, The radical deputies tied to the provincial Carboneria expressed on that occasion their full favor of granting important powers at the local level to the chief of the sect, terribly alienating the moderate part of the assembly, who were mainly city-dwelling Neapolitans, among which several later-comer infiltrators directly in contact with the government and the top official of the capital. They were worried that an excessive centrifugal tendency would to take root in the provinces and decided for that to somehow satisfy the government's request. Hence, a compromise was reached, giving rise to an unprecedented form of administrative law, for which the figure of an intendant prefect was maintained, nominated by the kings. But at the same time, the administrative political direction of the province was assigned to the Deputazione, formed by elective members, passed from 7 to 11, with all their important functions reconfirmed. This legislation also applied to municipalities, governed by a mayor and administered by an elected municipal body. So it was precisely on the occasion of the debate on provincial autonomies that political divergences emerged for the first time, not only between the government and the parliament, but also within the parliament itself. I don't see very well with the slide. This would be one of the primary causes, together with the diplomatic international ones, of the revolutionary epilogue crashed on March 7th, 1821, in Rieti, with the defeat of Napoleon army under the command of General Guglielmo Pepe by the troops of Holy Alliance. It was the very first time we see the conflict between Democrats and moderates, a never healed contrast of the future Italian Risorgimento. Previously, despite the critical situation of the kingdom, on March 1st, 1821, the parliament also opened its second legislature with an exemplary gesture of a civic courage. I will end. Later, on March 19, the Calabrian deputy, the great patriot Giuseppe Poerio, who had sided with the Napoleon Republic of 1799 and whose death sentence had been commuted by Napoleonic pardon, presented in the name of the Assembly a solemn protest, as it was written, before God and men for national independence. One of the youngest deputies, the Abruzzese Marquis Dragonetti, a fiery Carbonaro, who would be re-elected in the later parliaments of 1848 and 1861, joined to it the following noble expression. While the present generation does not merit the benefits of our Constitution, future generations, which will be more virtuous than ours, demand from us this act of protest of our freedom and national independence. It was a prophetic and courageous call to arms of the kingdom population. At around 3 in the afternoon of the same day, the policy commissioner placed the seals on the door of the church of San Sebastiano, where, as was written on the proclamation posted there, where the so-called deputies were used to meet. Last year, in October 1st, 2020, in the presence of the mayor and the city authorities of Naples, At the end of the conference, I mentioned it at the beginning of this paper, a plaque was placed next to where the Church of San Sebastiano stood, the quarter of the Assembly, that collapsed in 1850. To commemorate, as we can read, the national parliament of the two Sicilies, first elected by universal male suffrage, overmade by the king's betrayal and terminated by the force of Austrian arms, but alive in memory as a glory for the unification of Italy. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria Sofia, for your contribution. And the last contribution this afternoon will be by Spirion Vlachopoulos. He is a professor at the University in Athens in the law school. And the title of his contribution is The Normative and Symbolic Value of Constitutions of the Greek Revolution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I would like to thank the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens, our alma mater, and also the International Commission for the History of Representative and Parliamentary institutions for the kind invitation. I'm going to be very brief because I'm the last speaker, and the last speaker has always to be very brief. And the topic of my presentation is the normative and symbolic value of the revolutionary constitutions. When we speak about the revolutionary constitutions, we mean the constitutions which were drafted during the Greek Revolution against the Turks. So we have three constitutions of the time. The first one is the Constitution of Epidavros, 1822. The second one is the Constitution of Astros, the next year, 1823. And the last one, a revolutionary constitution, is the Constitution of Trizina, 1827. After that, we didn't have a constitution in Greece because the Assembly of the Greeks decided to suspend the Constitution of Trizina of 1827. And until 1844, in Greece, we had no constitution. This was the time of absolute monarchy. So the constitutions of the Greek revolutions are named after the places where the constitutions were drafted and voted. Epidavros, 22, Astros, 23, and Trizina, 27. I have to say from the beginning that they were not fully implemented, or to be more precise, they were only to a very small extent implemented. This is the characteristic of the revolutions of the Greek constitution. But as I'm going to explain further, I think they had a great symbolic value. So we have, of course, to see and examine the revolutions of the struggle, of the Greek struggle against the Turks in the more general constitutional, ideological, and political framework of the time. Of course, they were influenced from works like the draft constitution of Regas Velestellis or the Hellenic Normative by the anonymous author, and of course by the ideal of constitutionalism and enlightenment of that time. We had also the influence coming from the great constitutions of that time. We have first of all the declarations of the rights of man and citizen of 1789. We have the three French constitutions, 1791, 93, and 95. And I think it's quite interesting that the Greeks during the revolution were influenced by which constitution? By the American Constitution of the year 1787. It's very interesting that the Greeks were influenced by a constitution from another continent. This is also something very, very interesting. Which are the main characteristics of the constitutions of the struggle? First of all, the democratic character, the democratic nature of the constitutions, they were republican constitutions. That means that the Greeks decided not to have a king. Why the Greeks decided not to have a king? This is a very, very big question, and perhaps this is the topic of another conference. But it's very interesting to see that the Greeks decided not to have a king in a period of time where most of the countries in Europe had a king. We had two bodies, the parliamentary body, this was called in Greek, it was the vouletikon, and we had also the executive body, a collective body, and we had also an independent judicial power. I have also to say that the constitutions were drafted by assemblies, and the members of these assemblies were elected by local assemblies. Of course, they were not fully representative, because we must not forget that at that time the Greeks were fighting against the Turks, and unfortunately we have heard that many times today they were fighting also against each other. But there were assemblies, there were national assemblies, and the members of these assemblies were elected by local assemblies, and there was also freedom of speech in this assembly. So the first characteristic of the constitutions of the struggle is the democratic character of the constitution. The main characteristic is, according to my point of view, the liberal character of the constitutions. We have many, many fundamental rights to see in the constitutions. Beginning with the constitution of Epidavros, we see fundamental rights like, for example, religious freedom. Of course, with the establishment of the prevailing religion, that of the Eastern Orthodox Church, we have also the right to property, with a ban on the retroactivity of the tax laws. We have the right to honor and security. We have the prohibition of torture and general confiscation. And we have the protection of the citizen by independent courts. This catalog of fundamental rights is enriched, of course, in the next constitution of the Constitution of Astros of 1823. According to my point of view, the most moving, let's say, provision of that constitution is the abolishment of slavery. Already in the year 1823, there in the Constitution of Astros you can read, in the Greek territory, a human being is neither sold nor bought. A slave of any race and of any religion, when he has trodden the Greek soil, is free and cannot be claimed by his tyrant. So we have the abolishment of slavery already in the year 1823. And we have even more fundamental rights, like, for example, the freedom of the press. We have also the principle of proper trial by impartial courts. And we have also another classical fundamental rights, the right of petition to the parliament. And it is also very interesting to note, to point out, that in the Constitution of Astros, we had also the obligation of the state to protect and support education, commerce, and agriculture. I would say that in this sense, we have some kind of social rights already in 1823. The most complete catalog of fundamental rights is to be seen in the Constitution of Trizina of 1827, but I'm going to come to this point at the end of my presentation. If we had to categorize and to divide the constitutions of the struggle, I would say that we can separate them into two categories. On the one hand, we have the first two constitutions of Epidavros and Trizina, and on the other hand, we have the constitution, of Epidavros and Astros, and on the other hand, we have the last revolutionary constitution of Trizina of 1827. Well, in the first two constitutions, I think the main characteristic is the mutual distrust between the parliamentary and the executive body. The one body depended on the other, and neither of them could act independently. So this was a result and also the expression of the fight going on also between the Greeks. We had the Greeks from the mainland, we had the Greeks from Peloponnese, we had also the officers, we had the politicians, and this mutual distrust was also to be seen in the first two constitutions. But also because of the civil war. The war against the Turks didn't go well, and that's why the Greeks realized, this is also a sign of the political realism of the Greeks of that time, that they needed a strong central executive power. And this was the governor, the one-faced central executive man, which was, of course, Kapodistrian, as we have already heard today. He was elected for a long period of 7 years. That's a real long period. He was immune. He was inviolable. Of course, the Constitution of Trezina did not prescribe the way he was elected, but this is also a sign of that times, and this is also a proof that the constitutions are actually show and reflect the conditions of its time. This is the one main characteristic of the Constitution of Trezina. The other characteristic is the catalog of the fundamental rights that are guaranteed in the Constitution of Trezina. We have a clear and complete catalog of fundamental rights, and I think many modern constitutions could be jealous of that catalog of fundamental rights. So, in the Constitution of Trezina, we have extensive guarantees of personal security and safeguards in the context of criminal proceedings. We have the presumption of innocence of the accused person. We have the publicity of court meetings, the public announcement of court decisions, the prohibition of imposing a double penalty for the same offense, what we call today in the law school non bis in idem. We have the protection of property with the possibility, of course, of expropriation with prior compensation. We have also the economic freedom and the freedom of education, the prohibition of preventive censorship, and also the non-retroactive application of laws in general, and not only of the criminal laws, as it is the case today in the Greek Constitution and in the majority of the European constitutions. We have a modern catalog of fundamental rights, I think one of the most modern catalogs also for our times. So, now I would like to come to the end and to the central question of my presentation. Which is the value, actually, of this Constitution of the Struggle? Is there a normative value? I think there is a very little normative value because they were not implemented. There were constitutions which were not implemented. The Greeks were fighting against the Turks and also against each other. And actually, we didn't have a real state. A real state organization, in Greece we had actually, according to my point of view, perhaps the historians here are present today are more competent to point this issue, but I think we had, let's say, the Greek state began with Kapodistrian after 1827, and the real state we have after King Otto after 1832. So, actually, the normative value of the Greek constitutions of the struggle was very little, was very poor. But, and this is the main thing, the constitutions of the struggle had a very, very important symbolic value. First of all, we have seen that there were democratic constitutions. And they were also very liberal because there was a clear catalog of fundamental rights. And I think also through these constitutions, the Greeks were educated in a democratic and liberal spirit. And also, according to my point of view, it is not a coincidence that Greece was one of the first states in Europe which adopted the universal vote with the Constitution of 1844. In a time, 1844, in a time, of course, for the conditions of that time, only for the men, but this is another story. In a time where, for example, in Great Britain, the mother of the parliamentary system, only 1 out of the 12 men had the right to vote. In Greece, we had the universal vote also, already in the year 1844. The second ground, the second reason, because I believe that the constitutions of the struggle had a very important symbolic value, is the fact that the Greeks believed at that time that there can be no Greek state without a constitution. So constitution was an essential part of the state, of the fight of the Greeks against the Turks. And they believed that constitution is a part of the state and that cannot exist a state without a constitution. For the Greeks of that time, I have the intention sometimes that the constitutions were more important than the international recognition of the independence of the Greek state. The third thing, and for me, is even more important because I'm a constitutional lawyer, so I think that the Greeks actually realized what is constitution because they were very strongly influenced by the American Constitution of 1787. Nowadays, we all know that, with the exception of United Kingdom in Europe, that in continental Europe, we define constitution as the legal text which prevails over the other legal text. Of course, this is a common ground for us, the constitutional lawyers, also in the continental Europe, but after the Second World War. At that time, it was not self-evident that there must be a constitution which prevails over the other legal text. So, for example, in the Greek constitution of Astros of 1823, you can read, under no excuses and circumstances can the administration legislate against the present constitution. This is the finest, according to my point of view, the finest expression of constitutionalism, that we must have a constitution which prevails over the other texts, legal texts, and no majority can legislate against the constitution. And even more evident was this belief in the constitution of Trezina, where you could read that the present constitution prevails over all other laws. So we have the finest expression of constitutionalism through the constitutions of the struggle. And the last point I would like to raise in the frame of the symbolic value of the constitution of the struggle is that the fact that the Greeks, of course, knew that at that time there was no Greek state. But I would say that the constitutions of the struggle were actually something like a workshop of ideas. The Greeks were fighting and at the same time were exchanging ideas, and they were fighting in the world of ideas, and they were exchanging ideas about fundamental rights, about the state organization, and about how was to be seen the Greek state of the future. And it is very important to note that in this workshop of ideas, they participated not only the Greeks, but I would say the best intellectuals and scholars of that time. Jeremy Bentham, we all know Jeremy Bentham, commented the first Greek constitution of Epidavros of 1822. Can you imagine in a time where there was no internet, the people could not travel easily? Jeremy Bentham, one of the biggest, one of the most important intellectuals of the time, commented the Greek constitution because at that time, the personalities of that time, especially the liberal personalities of that time, thought that Greece was a good idea to think about constitutional rights, constitution, state organization, and things like that. And also politicians like Thomas Jefferson wrote letters about the constitutional organization of the Greek state. Thomas Jefferson did not, like Jeremy Bentham, commented on the first constitution, but he wrote letters suggesting the Greeks how to organize their constitutional state. So I think this is the main point, that at that time, Greece was important not only for Greece, not only for us, the Greeks, but for whole Europe and also for the world, say, because it was a real workshop of constitutional and constitutional ideas. And according to my point of view, this is the reason why we have to be proud of the revolutionary constitutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, President, for your contribution. And now is the moment for dialogue with the speaker. And we have here 3 papers about 19th century Greek history, and the other paper about Napolitan Parliament. Any questions for the speakers? Yeah. Yes.
Thank you. Just an idea, not really a question about revolutions in general. If I remember rightly, I think Lenin once said, a revolution happens not if those below no longer want to go on like that, because they often do and it doesn't matter, but if those on top are no longer able to go on like before. So at least in the early modern period, I think the start of almost every revolution is a state bankruptcy. I mean, it's very much evident in the case of the Great French Revolution. I mean, France can no longer pay her way, Britain can. Even the Austrians can, and that means a lot. So how does that play out sort of in the long 19th century? The connection between bankruptcy and revolutions may be no longer that clear, but is there some? Question mark.
Sure.
Well, actually, there is clearly a connection between bankruptcy and revolution, generally between the bad economic conditions and revolution, of course. As we know, bankruptcy precedes the revolution in France. It is practical bankruptcy which precedes the revolution in Russia, 1917, and actually in Greece, 1843. I'm not quite sure, however, that this may be a boost on the road to the revolution. I'm not quite sure that this should be a necessary, a conditio sine qua non. I think I can recall important revolutions which were not preceded necessarily by bankruptcy. I think in 1848 it was not all Europe that had gone bankrupt. Although, of course, the sense of social injustice and mostly the sense of economic failure by the Ancien regime systems in which the political power belonged to very small communities who no longer commanded economic power. I mean, this disparity, the concentration of economic power to other people who did not have political power and who were being excluded by the Ancien regime, and the economic failure of this regime, I think this is certainly, I would say that this is a common case in all our cases on the roads to revolutions. Yeah, but yes, bankruptcy is a boost. Undoubtedly, it's a boost many times. I'm sure there are more. There are many more cases where bankruptcy precedes revolutions.
Would like to
I don't quite know why I stood up there because I'm not sure that I'm really an expert in this, but in the Greek Revolution that we've been talking about today, there does, I mean, I wouldn't say it was bankruptcy, but if you want to talk about an economic crisis, it actually seems to have been an unintended byproduct of an Ottoman attempt to sort of rationalize its extraction policies that, at least in the short term, immediately in the decades leading up to 1821, had a tremendous economic distress on the countryside. And so that, you know, this idea that the Greeks were always waiting for revolt, there was certainly economic factors that pushed matters in those decades.
I think that international relations is related with the public debt. According to the public debt, you can understand better the international relation between different countries. Well, which is one reflection.
Thank you. Can you understand me? I have a question. I have two questions. A question to Professor Corciullo. You don't hear. Can you hear me, so? I have a question. Yes? I would like to know where was a bigger problem, the relationship between parliament and government, or between the parliament itself? You have told there were conflicts. Where was the bigger problem? Where were the most questions? And a question to Professor Vlachopoulos. You have spoken of implementation, of a lack of implementation. But my question is, I know that there were institutions and they were working. Where was this problem of implementation? Because it wasn't a situation where there were no institutions at all. It was only of a paper. There were institutions working and following the principles of a constitution. So in which sense have I to understand this lack of implementation?
In this period, at the first opening of Parliament, we have two contrasts. One between the government, who was entirely composed by Napoleonic ministers, and the Parliament in all parts. But in this Parliament, we have two typologies of deputies. One radical, that are perhaps 40%, and the other 60% moderate. But all the Parliament, either moderate and radical, was against to maintain the Napoleonic institution that the government would maintain. So a contrast between government and Parliament was about this point. But in this moment, when the radical deputies would have liked to put, to give more power to the Carboneria sect, the moderate deputies were against this possibility. So they decided to go in favor of some request, not all requests, some request of a government, and they made a compromise for which the intendant, typologicamente like Napoleonic, but without less powers, will maintain, the government maintain this intent, but near to the intent was this important constitutional of Cadix derivation, la deputazione, which was comprised by elected men, to whom, la quale, many powers will done. So the contrast between government and deputies after became a contrast between radicals and Democrats. And this is very important typology because, like you know, in our Italian parliament, we have in the future, we will have in the future many contrasts between radicals and the moderate, and that has been the fault of our Risorgimento. It's okay? Thank you.
Thank you, Maria Sofia.
Thank you very much for your question. That's a very interesting question. Well, first of all, at that time, the Greeks were fighting against the Turks. And if you fight, you think more about your life and less for constitutions, institutions, things like that. The second thing is that, of course, there were some institutions, like, for example, the parliamentary body, the Voulefikon, and the executive body. But because of the war conditions and also because of the civil war, they were not the proper time in order to operate correctly. For example, the executive body, I think we've heard that, was moving from place to place because the enemies were against them and they were fighting against them. So you cannot operate correctly, properly, if you have to move from the one place to the other. The third thing is that in order to have institutions and in order to have the application of the Constitution, you need money, you need peace, you need education, you need institutions. Actually, the Greeks didn't have at that time. So, for example, there is there to read in all revolutionary Greek constitutions that we have an independent judiciary, but how can you have courts if you don't have a law school, for example? How can you have courts if the state doesn't operate correctly? So I would say that that's why I talked about a workshop of ideas. The Greeks of that time wanted actually to show to the Europeans, especially to the Europeans of the time, or of course also under the influence of the Americans, that we are here and we want to be like you, the Europeans. We want to build a state like your state. And this is to read it very, very clearly in the Declaration of the Independence of the Greeks. A text, actually, which I think it's even more important than the constitutions of the struggle. There, it is stated by the rebellious Greeks that we want to be like you, the Europeans, with a state which works properly, with fundamental rights, things like that. So it was more an exercise of ideas and just to show more the Europeans that the Greeks are like them and independent, and they want to build an independent and civilized state.
Thank you, Professor. Any question?
Well, I would like to thank for... Can you hear me? Better now? Okay. So I'd like to thank you for your papers, especially for the insight and the value of constitutions and constitutionalism that you showed us, and especially on the outlook of transnational influence, which is something that we can work on together in now and in the future times. And we heard about another symbol in the speech of Jonathan Hall, and that was the reception of the ancient Greece. That brings me to my question to you, Mr. Vlachopoulos. Is there any reception of the ancient Greece, which is, of course, so to say, a trademark for this young state and something they can refer to, they can talk about? Is there anything as a symbolic transfer in the Constitution?
Thank you.
That's a very difficult question to answer. Of course, you can read there in the Declaration of the Independence of the Greeks that they also referred to ancient Greece. And I would say that the democratic elements of the Greek constitutions have also to do with the heritage of the Greeks and the ancient Greece, because that's perhaps is one of the reasons. I have already said that this is a very interesting topic for another conference, why the Greek chose the republican character of the constitutions and they didn't want a king. I think that had to do with the ideals of democracy of the old times. Well, I'm not quite sure that the Greeks were influenced by ancient Greece in the frame of the fundamental rights, because the Greeks of ancient times had another conception of fundamental rights, which is not the conception of fundamental rights we have after the French Declaration. So there was a connection, but it was part of the influences on the Greek constitutions. I think perhaps more important was the influences coming from Europe and the American constitutions, because I insist that the Greeks wanted to show the Europeans that we are here and we are like you.
Thank you. Well, no, I'm sorry. Very brief. Very brief. The last one. The organizer said the last one.
Thank you for the interesting speeches. I have one short question. You can hear me, I think, about the personality of the first president of the Republic, of Ioannis Kapodistrias. In Polish historiography, he is known as a Count Kapodistria, one of the leaders of the conservative faction in the Tsar Alexander I Romanov surrounding. So how it has happened that he switched side practically from the conservative leader to the democratic president of the modern Greece? Thank you.
I'm sorry, I could not hear very well. Could you please repeat the essence of the question?
How it has happened that conservative Count Kapodistria, one of the leaders of the political circles in the Russian Empire, switched to the democratic president of the modern Greece?
Well, as a matter of fact, Kapodistria was a very serious person. He did not switch. It's the Greeks who switched. I mean, they started with these liberal democratic ideals. I fully agree with my friend Spiros Vlachopoulos. There's no doubt that the inspiration behind the Greek Revolution is, there are actually direct references to the notions of the French Revolution. Point is, you could not secure European support at the age of the Restoration, if you say such things. So what happens, in my view, is that very slowly, well, perhaps not that slowly, the Greeks start to try to find ways to say, they understand they cannot win this war by themselves. The Ottoman Empire is huge, especially after the Egyptian intervention in 1825. Things are very difficult. So, okay, they adopt this extremely progressive constitution, 1827, that Professor Vlachopoulos told us about. At the same time, however, they need to find inroads in this very traditionalist, very cruel world of the European monarchies of that time. So, in effect, what they do is, as a reassurance for the European chancelleries, the conservative, hyper-conservative chancelleries of that time, they actually call into as a head of state, a representative of that conservative Europe. And then, after his assassination, when he was assassinated, another representative of that conservative Europe comes, King Otto of Bavaria, of Greece then. As I understand it, it is a kind of, they have to do it. I mean, there's no other way. There are huge conflicts of a political nature, but also of an intellectual, cultural nature, because, I mean, these people revolt. They want to create a European nation state, but they do not necessarily understand how the European nation state works. For example, national army. national education service, or a national taxation system, which according to some, the Greeks have failed to set up even now. It is a big transition, huge transition. And just like water, when water goes underground, it sometime eventually will find its way to the surface again. And this is how I understand the so-called constitutional revolution. I said it was, in fact, it was a military coup of 1843 and the adoption of the first constitution of the Greek state in 1844. There is a, let's say, a dynamic of these ideas, these notions, constitutional notions in Greek history. The Greek state was born, I mean, it was a child of these things, but it had to give way to the conservative dominance of the Europe of Restoration. No, Kapodistrian did not come as a liberal leader. He came as a very conservative leader, and he was assassinated as one of them.
Thank you, Francis. And now we have a new meeting at 7 o'clock. We are going to visit the whole Parliament at 7 o'clock and opening of the exhibition, The Massacre of Chios. Thank you very much for your participation and for your assistance in this plenary session. And later we can see together in the all parliaments. Thank you.